Hello and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. Today we're going to be taking a little bit deeper look at the topic of public opinion. So the first thing that we're going to look at are, especially in this episode, are the different ways that public opinion can be crowded and the difficulty that the average person has with coming to terms with real facts in an environment that's outside of their actual experience. The two first concepts that we're going to be looking at right now are censorship and social sets. We'll start with censorship because it's a little bit more easily approachable of a concept, even though social sets aren't necessarily complicated. They're just sort of the general stratification that we tend to see in societies applied to information and to the handing down of different kinds of ideas, concepts, and pseudo-environments. So, censorship. Censorship can take many different forms, as if you've been on YouTube recently, you've probably seen a couple of these, but it's actually a little bit more complicated of a topic than it might first appear. Censorship actually in a direct form isn't all that necessary, and when censorship is taken in a direct form to particularly affect someone's pseudo-environment to get them to believe something that a smaller group or a more powerful group necessarily wants them to believe, this is referred to as propaganda. Propaganda is a sort of tricky topic, and I don't want to go too far into it right now because that is actually going to be the topic for the next episode, episode 24. But suffice to say for now that propaganda is a form of censorship where people are intentionally manipulated because they do not have access to the facts, and the people who do have access to those facts, to the greater environment, place some kind of barrier in between the reality and the imagined reality within the average person. So propaganda is an extreme form of censorship. There are many other kinds of censorship that happen all the time, consciously or subconsciously. Obfuscation, word choice, lies of omission. There's lots of different ways that censorship can be applied without the person necessarily even knowing. We'll talk a little bit more about stereotypes in the next episode to see how it could be that someone could be there and to experience an event and not come away with what actually happened. But for now, it's important to note that people see what they already think that they see. They define the world through terms before they actually come to know the world. And because of this, people are liable to give unfair accounts of things that have actually happened. Obfuscation is an important one. It's when something important happens and then something else is kind of used to drive that down. It's where the concept of a limited hangout could come into play, which is where just enough information about an event that is upsetting is given to the general population that they can't imagine that it could possibly be any worse, when in reality it is, and the limited hanging out of the information itself is used to prevent the massive hanging out of the rest of the information. That's something that we'll have to talk about at a later time as well, when we talk about the CIA and the FBI and different kinds of organizations like that. But another very popular form of censorship is actually self-censorship, when people are afraid of the way that they will be perceived for saying, doing, or believing something openly. This is something that we'll definitely get more into when we talk about social sets here in just a minute, but one form of self-censorship that is quite potent to the topic that we're talking about today involves FDR, the president from the late 20s, 30s, and into the 40s. The average person, while he was alive campaigning, running for 16 years as president, did not actually know that FDR was wheelchair bound, and that he had polio from a young age, and that it had destroyed his ability to walk around. He was always the first person into events and the last person to leave. They would stand him up on the podium and have his hands grabbing it, and he would just kind of be leaning up against it. They would give him crutches to make him appear to be standing upright. And the press, for some reason, I'm gonna have to look a little bit more into this to come to a more definitive conclusion, but the press decided that they were not going to discuss the fact that FDR wasn't actually standing there. And most of the other world leaders on the stage actually didn't say anything either. And this kind of comes, again, into what we'll talk about a little bit later with social sets and another form of censorship, which is the private life itself. How much of your private life do other people really need to know? Does it directly affect the population to know that you've had a debilitating disease in the past? Is it something that the average person needs to know? And then when an event happens where a health crisis occurs and suddenly the people who voted for you are no longer actually able to see you come through with the things that you said you were going to do, did that necessitate you coming clean with your past earlier? The concept of the private life and the public figure and the crossover between what kind of information should be shared and shouldn't is in itself a form of censorship. Censorship is seen as a negative word, but I don't know that there's a lot of people that would argue that having a private life, which is in and of itself a form of censorship and self-censorship, is a negative thing. So there's a lot of mixed concepts when we're talking about censorship. The point isn't whether censorship, the point of this video isn't whether censorship is a good thing or a bad thing. The point is the fact that it exists, it obscures the information that you have available to you, and it makes it much more difficult to get a clear picture of the environment outside of your general experience. So, on top of censorship, there's also the concept of the social set. A social set is something like a hierarchy, but possibly more akin to a biological clan, wherein the people of a specific social set tend to cling together to share information. Social sets are generally founded around what you might consider economic value, but in this term, with the social set itself, the economic value isn't necessarily the dollar so much as it is information. Information, skill, ways of thinking about things. Somebody who goes into a factory every day that has a very repetitive life and sees the repetition of their existence patterned all the way around them will more likely believe, speak with, and understand another person who has a similar situation. Different, birds of a feather flock together. I had two sayings stuck in my head there, but this is essentially what a social set is. And social sets tend to coalesce around people with the split of a private and public life. There has to be someone necessarily on top who decides what the social set itself is going to act like, how they are determined, and what the general belief structure to be handed down to the lower people is. Because the further down you get in a social set, the more dedicated the individual is to their private life, and the less dedicated they are to being able to go out and to experience different parts of the greater environment which they do not interact with, and so they necessarily need someone that can help them make sense of the world to develop their public opinions. Social sets are something that's expanded a lot in the past 100 years or so. It used to be that you could know fewer people and have fewer reading circulation. Businessmen had their own newspapers, college students had their own, different people had different forms of education and entertainment that they would turn to help construct a solid understanding of the world around them. And today it's more or less coalesced down into much larger groups that respond in much more similar ways, especially in the past few years. So someone sitting atop a social set might be a politician. They're usually people that are directly entangled with affairs that take them outside of their own environment, outside of their own country, and they're usually people with split public and private lives. So when you hear somebody talk about the culture of a company or of a work environment, this is the different people coalescing around what they believe to be an accurate way of representing their life and representing the world around them, and using this representation handed down to them from the people at the top, usually a CEO or a board, who themselves are in their own separate social set, which includes other people that are CEOs and other people that are board members. And a lot of people, especially when it comes to public affairs information, go to different news corporations, and the different news corporations have these reporters and these editors which make their own social sets, and these social sets in turn are reliant on the people that are actually going out, the politicians, the diplomats, those kinds of people, for secondhand information. And while a social set is useful, there are many drawbacks to it. One of the first being if a diplomat goes out and has a conversation and then comes back, and then he speaks to a reporter, and the reporter writes up a story, and then the editor takes the story and puts it into print, and then the person in charge of circulation distributes it, and then someone working with you has that paper and lets you borrow it for a moment, and then asks you, do you believe in this conclusion, or do you believe this kind of thing? And then you know that the way that he thinks necessarily correlates in some way with the way that you see the world. You're now something like 6-7 degrees of separation from the actual event that happened. And it's like a game of telephone, where as the different social sets percolate the ideas, there's only so much overlap between them, and so they sort of have to be translated through different worldviews and through different conceptions of reality down to the level of wherever you're at, which necessarily flattens them out, which is a concept we'll talk more about in the final part of the series. But suffice it to say that when you hear a news item, when you hear something about public affairs, about a foreign country, it's always important to ask yourself, who actually heard this? Who actually said it? Who did they tell? How did that person get the information to someone else who got the information to me? How many people separated the actual incident from me, myself? And what is the different ways of thinking that each one of these people in this chain could impart their beliefs and their own ideological structures onto the information to make it less accurate than it necessarily would have been if I would have physically been there. And if you do that, then you start to realize how delicate the information that's actually passed on to you tends to be. So, when we brought up earlier self-censorship, this also ties directly into the social set. When the reporters didn't want to say anything about FDR being in a wheelchair or previously almost dying from polio, they were all together in their own social set, and it was decided that their integrity or their silent, tacit agreement, however you want to put it, meant that they could not necessarily be the one to act outside of the social set that they were present in. And because of this, nobody spoke up and said anything about the fact that he had been afflicted and he was actually not standing up there at the podium. He was propped up by some kind of metal legs. So the social set not only pushes you further away from the information itself and flattens out what actually happened to a more general feeling than an actual acute fact, it also causes people to act more similarly to each other and to be afraid of the repercussions of not doing so. So to wrap up this part, we're going to look at 3 more concepts that are very important to public opinion and unfortunately have a negative effect overall on the development in the average person of their concept of public affairs, those being time, words, and attention. As I stated with the social sets, as you get further down on a social set or to a lower social set, people's private lives tend to consume more and more of their daily exertion of their time than the ability to focus on public affairs, foreign concepts, and acquiring new experiences. And because of this, time is of the necessity when coming to a conclusion on public affairs or on different concepts that must be necessarily utilized in a society where all people participate and all people are expected to participate. It is not possible for any single person, even the people further up the social hierarchies, to constantly be able to develop new ideas and to experience new things, and so people necessarily need to split their time. It was true 100 years ago, and unfortunately it's still true to this day, that people tend to spend relatively little time on the news, and when they do spend time on the news, it tends to be particularly on editorials And today, editorials, especially with large news broadcasting companies, with TV shows and things like that, come more and more in the form of punditry, where someone gets the information, and rather than sitting down and reading it to you or relaying that information directly to you as close to factually accurate as possible, they explain it to you through their own preconceived notions, biases, and as we'll talk about later, stereotypes. So the average person necessarily doesn't have a lot of time to focus on these things, and generally when they do, they tend to focus on more flowery deliveries of the news itself as opposed to more concrete things. And as things have gone over the past several decades, it's actually getting harder and harder to find real sort of fact-based attempted objective reporting, because that's not what people tend to consume, and so that's not where the dollars tend to be. The next important limitation itself are words. And words are a very imperfect medium. Even in the English language, with all the words that we have available, we tend to have different kinds of ways of relating information and ways of using these words. And it's important to note that words aren't just, they are intangible, but words are almost a form of currency. They hold value over time, and they can actually be devalued rather quickly, which is certainly happening in our society today, especially with commercialization and advertisements, where it is fantastic, this is the greatest thing ever, this is the pinnacle of this sort of achievement. In World War I, the British chain of command for the military and the French had a lot of discrepancies, because the French would want to post how there was a glorious victory and the Germans were utterly crushed, and the facts on the battle was that both sides lost relatively similar numbers in the particular engagement that they were speaking of, and no land was lost or gained by either side, and it returned essentially to the status quo of the front line. And the British would not print these articles with the same over-the-top language, because they didn't believe that it would be good overall for the English language to be inflated to such a degree that things that were relatively mundane were now being blown to the largest proportions using those words. And there is generally a crash once people start to realize that all of the top shelf words are the ones that are always being selected and used for just about any kind of delivery or any kind of speech or event. Then there tends to be an overall flattening out. When everything is fantastic and the best and the greatest, then necessarily nothing is. And so the way that different ideas are conveyed, and the way that the words which are used to convey these ideas are brought to people, can necessarily have a direct impact on whether you're capable of judging if something really did happen the way that it was supposed to be, or if everything is portrayed that way. Then anytime something new comes out that's supposed to be fantastic or the best, you always kind of have that thought in the back of your head, like, didn't that just happen a week ago? How many times can the newest and most fantastic thing come out? And this seeds sort of an air of disbelief, and this can be quite difficult to overcome, especially if it's something that happens continuously. So words are something of a form of currency, and the overinflation of the value of the words and the refusal to use correct and accurate words can have large negative consequences. And then there's also the fact that there are things that words can't describe, or that words fail to be able to factually describe. And the most basic explanation for something like that would be art. You can have especially with a lot of modern, postmodern, and the last 200 years kind of art, you can have a lot of different people look at the same painting and get a lot of different things out of it, and none of them are necessarily incorrect. It's just that we have more ideas and feelings and concepts inside of ourselves than we necessarily have words, which is why new words tend to be created. But at the rate of new words being minted, there will always be more feelings and more ideas and more ways of interpreting something than necessarily can be crafted through the different words. And there's always the responsibility of the fact that words don't spontaneously arise. Words have to be said by a person. if that person doesn't have the right words to say and they happen to be the one person that's at that experience, then there's no way possible for that experience to be related to anyone else. So words and time are definitely large factors in obscuring facts and experiences from the public at large. And then the final one would be attention. And this is actually very interesting. There were several studies run by Carl Jung and a few others, and I think there's been repetitive studies that have shown similar results since, where if you get a group of people and you have them take some kind of test in a quiet, easily observed environment, and then you have them take a relatively similar test where there's a repetitive clanging noise, and then one where there's a random sound that happens, and different things like that, there's actually a depression in the overall IQ signatures and the overall ability to critically think because of the random sounds, even the repetitive sounds. And so when someone wakes up in the morning and they see their news item and they go to work and they're stuck in traffic and there's lots of people honking, there's loud sounds in their workplace, there's all this buzzing and whirring, it actually depresses your ability to think critically. And a lot of people that are in areas where large events are happening, where there's a lot of commotion and noise, and where the event that people necessarily need to know about is going on, have this same problem where they're going to have a harder time thinking critically and understanding what it is that's going on because of the effects of the sound and their ability to split their attention between the different things that are all going on. So it would be necessary for everyone to be able to unplug and to sit down and to take a couple hours out of their day and to lay out whatever it is that they're trying to think about and to study it quietly. Unfortunately, this isn't possible for everyone. And so a lot of people are making decisions on very large public affairs style topics and policies that they're going to go vote for, that they're going to incorporate into their belief structure, while they are in environments that split their attention and necessarily lower their ability to think critically. Alright, well, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. There's one more part in this series, and then we're going to wrap this one up and move on to the next episode. I've had a lot of fun doing these. I hope that you've enjoyed. My new setup and everything seems to be working very well. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, I hope you leave a like. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. But until next time, remember, Ave Imperator!